Hello, welcome to Rose Floral School, the show. I'm Catherine, and this is episode 2. The topic for today's episode is flower processing. So, this is going to be a good, comprehensive, sort of foundational knowledge of processing your flowers. And the first place we're going to start is with what is flower processing? So, flower processing is basically a fancy phrase, or just an all-encompassing phrase, I guess, for everything that happens from the wholesaler to your flowers being nice and hydrated and ready to work with. When they're ready to work with, they are processed officially, so that the whole system, you could say, is called processing. Of course, you'll get your flowers from the wholesaler. You'll want to have the buckets ready, give them a fresh cut, all that good stuff, so that they can drink water and be just the best for your designs. So that's what processing is. And like I said, we just call it processing. So if you're talking to another florist, if you are going to work at a shop and they mention processing, it means a lot of bucket washing, a lot of stem cutting. So the buckets that I like to use, I have an assortment. My best suggestion is to get a variety of buckets. You'll find that you really like to use some and some you might hate, but it will also depend on your flower materials. So you want to make sure you have different heights and different widths of buckets to accommodate your different types of stems. Some flowers come from wholesaler, a lot taller than others. Sometimes you'll use a lot of one, type of flower and you want a bigger bucket. Or if it's something a little more dainty and you only have a little bit, you'll want a nice small bucket so they're not tipping and flopping all over. I will also say I have gone through some phases of the buckets that I've liked to use. In the beginning, I preferred small to mid-sized buckets, which makes sense. A lot of the weddings that I first did were a little bit on the smaller to mid-size size. So I didn't have as many bunches that were the same type of thing. I might have a bunch of roses, 2 bunches of stock, 3 bunches of Alstro. And I personally like to separate my flowers by variety. So I don't like to have one bucket with 3 different types of flowers in it. I like all of the roses in one bucket. Or if I'm using 8 bunches of roses, then 2 bunches in this bucket, 2 bunches again. But not to have mixed varieties in a single bucket. That's somewhat personal preference. And also some flowers want different things, different heights of water, different flower food, different temperatures. And so it just makes sense to have one type of flower in their own bucket. But like I was saying in the beginning, I would only have 1 or 2 bunches of each variety, maybe at the most. So smaller buckets made more sense. Whereas now my weddings have gotten a little bit larger. And so I might be using 10 bunches of roses. And so I try to get buckets that fit at least 2 or 3 bunches so that I'm not having 500 buckets everywhere. Anyway, but I will show you, a handful of the varieties that I like. Like I said, having a different mix is super helpful just so that you have that versatility. So, of course, just a bucket. This is a 5-gallon bucket from the hardware store. Honestly, this has become one of my favorites. It just does the job, it does it well, and it is a nice size. So I do like just a regular bucket. You can also use, buckets like the smaller, almost like cleaning buckets. Those are nice if you're using shorter stems. They're not as tall and they end up almost buried in a tall bucket like that. So different sizes of buckets. That one was a 5-gallon, but I do have a bunch of 3-gallon that I use sometimes too. This one is like a beverage tub. So if anyone is listening and not watching the video, again, I'll try to describe. If you want to see the video, go down to the link in the description and you'll get to that if you don't see it where you are listening. But anyhow, this one is just like a beverage tub. So it's got the 2 handles. It's kind of got that ribbed pattern. You can probably picture it in your head if you're not watching the video. It looks like something you would use at 4th of July. And I love these for my greens. I use these for a lot of my bunches of branchy, brambly greenery. Huck is great in these. Pittosporum I like to use with these. You will want to fill them a little higher than normal when you use them for greens, just to make sure nothing is tipping out of the water. But just a beverage tub, these are my favorite. I usually get these on sale at, Joann's, Michael's at the end of the season. And they're super cheap, so that's always a bonus. We can save some money there. This one right here is a bussing tray, so you could get this online or at a restaurant supply store. I do use that from time to time. And then over here, these two are actually trash cans. So I forget how many gallons this one is, maybe a 3.5 or 5.5 gallon trash can. It's just like your black office garbage can. And honestly, these are one of my top favorites too. I just like the size. I feel like 2 bunches of roses fits perfectly in here, sometimes 3. And I like that it's not too broad at the bottom, so it feels like it holds them upright and keeps them from tilting around too much. And then this is another, actually a trash can, and actually like the look of this. I've used these before here and there. I've done flower bars or like flowers for church to hand out Mother's Day. And I do like the look of it, but I also like that they come in this nice, slick, smaller size. So if I'm just getting, say, 1 bunch of ranunculus or just, a smaller, daintier bloom, I like to have the smaller bucket for that too. And especially if you are just starting, I mean, I probably have, I don't even know how many buckets I have, maybe 40-ish would be my guess. I could be totally wrong. I'm looking at my pile of buckets over there right now. I could be wrong, but I would guess that I have maybe around 40 buckets. So if you are just starting, the garbage can route actually can sometimes be cheaper than an actual 5-gallon bucket for whatever reason. They are what I started with because I found that they were just a lot cheaper. And like I said, when you're starting and you're trying to get 20 buckets, even a $5 difference can help. So keep an eye out for that. So those are the different types of buckets that I like to use. When you are putting flowers in the bucket, you want to make sure that the height makes sense. So for this bucket here, you'd want your flowers to be at least this tall. If you are just listening, I would say you want the flowers to be 6-8 inches above at least, so that the actual bloomy parts are outside of the top of the bucket, not down in there. If they're down in there, they're going to be overcrowded. They're not going to have room to breathe. You might get some like mold, mildew, dampness going on in there, which we do not want. So make sure that the blooms of your flowers are, for the most part, above the rim of your bucket. But on the same case, you don't want them to be so tall. This is one of my tallest buckets, but for example, here's a shorter one. You wouldn't want to use something that's way up here, coming 2 feet out of the bucket, because it might try to tip out and then your flowers will be on the ground. So make sure that the height is appropriate, and then the width again is appropriate too. And whether that means you can only do 1 bunch of something in a bucket, or it has to be a bunch of something smaller, just make sure that they're not overly crowded. There are some varieties that particularly hate to be overcrowded. But in general, make sure they have some room to breathe. They can move around and they don't feel like they're smashed in there. So that kind of covers the buckets. And what what you always do is clean your buckets before you use them. I know some people, there are people out there that clean them after they use them and store them clean. In my mind, there's dirt, there's dust in the air, there's leaves flying around this place all the time. So I clean them right before I use them. It makes more sense to me. So when I clean my buckets, I use a cleaning product. This right here is by Syndicate. Syndicate is probably one of the larger floral supply companies. This is just called Fresh and Clean. It's the Syndicate sales cleaning product. Another one that I have used that I like is called BCD. It stands for deodorize, clean, and disinfect, I think. Doesn't really matter. All you need to know, go on Google. BCD is a good one too. But like I said, this one that I've been using lately is the Fresh and Clean from Syndicate. And honestly, I like both of those. Trying to think, you can do some research if you really want to find something specific. I've heard of people using bleach. I personally stay away from that, mostly because of the fumes and it's too messy. I've heard some discrepancies about whether dish soap is like like on the up and up or not. I have heard that it can leave a residue in the buckets that your flowers won't like love. I suggest using something made for flowers. It makes sense to me. I have loved this Fresh and Clean, or again, the DCD. Yeah. Anyway, so take your cleaning product, and honestly, I mean, not to sound like super basic here, but read the instructions on the back, at least be somewhat familiar with them. I never measure any of this. I mean, you'll see I use a scoop with the flower food, but I'm not out here measuring my cleaning product to my water. But I know it's 1 ounce. Do I know this? I believe it's 1 ounce to 1 gallon. I'm going to look on the back here. Yep, 1 ounce to 1 gallon. And so in my mind, I've just done enough baking in my life and whatnot, so I can eyeball, okay, that much is an ounce, a little more than maybe what I drink in my coffee. And when the water comes out of the spigot, I roughly know what a gallon is. Now, what I do when I clean my buckets, just for efficiency's sake, I take one bucket, I put it in the sink, and I start the tap, and then I put in more than an ounce, maybe a few ounces of the cleaner, and I let the water run for a couple of gallons. And then I take my solution and I dump it into, 3, 4, 5 of the buckets that I'm using. And then I start cleaning the first one. So the reason that I do that is A, so that I'm not in and out of the sink, 5 times as many times as I want to be. And B, while I'm cleaning the first bucket, there are 4 other buckets that have the solution in the bottom of them, and they're soaking. And that DCD, or this Fresh and Clean, it's doing its job sitting in there disinfecting, while it's soaking in the bucket, versus just in and then quickly having it back out. I like that those other buckets are sitting, they're soaking, it's in the bottom of the bucket, so that's the part that's always the dirtiest. So I just like the fact that it lets my buckets soak while I'm working on the ones before them. And like I said, then I have to put my one bucket in the sink, but I have 5 buckets ready to wash versus having to go in and out of the sink with 5 separate buckets. I don't know if it's just me, but something about going in and out of the sink, like the fewer times I can do that, the better. So I make a solution in one bucket, I share it among the first 5, and then I start washing my first bucket. I typically just use your regular dish sponge. That's what I use. Use what you want. But I like a sponge. That's what I use for my dishes in my house. So I guess I'm just a sponge gal. So I take my sponge. I like to start by going to the bottom of the bucket and swishing the water up to cover all of the sides of the inside. Again, kind of like what we said earlier, I like that then I get the solution washed up on the sides. So now the sides are also soaking in that disinfectant. And they're getting cleaned just by having the solution sitting on them. So I swish it all around, then I wash each side. I don't get too crazy. I mean, make them clean, but the fact is I'm not using this as a cup. My flowers are, so I do want it to be clean, but I'm not trying to take 5 days to clean my buckets. So I, swish, wash the sides. I get the bottom. I do the bottom probably the best. And you'll see too, some buckets just are really dirty because they had stock in them the week before, and stock are just a smelly, dirty flower when they sit in a bucket for 3 days. You'll be able to tell. If you have a really dirty bucket, give it that extra time, but otherwise get those sides washed, get the bottom extra good, and I completely ignore the outside. So then I move on and I go through all my buckets. Now, as I use that solution, I do reuse it. It is strong enough that it will disinfect even when the water looks dirty. The disinfectant is still there doing its job. So I'll take that bucket after it's clean and dump, the solution into the next bucket, move that one out of the way, and then I'll wash my next bucket with the same solution. Now, if I had a really, really dirty bucket, I try to do that one towards the end. Or if the solution just feels super scuzzy to you, then, don't use it anymore. Get some new solution. If I am washing 40, 50 buckets, I'll probably get a second or third batch of solution as I go. So use your own judgment on that. Reuse the solution a few times if you like. If it seems too dirty to you, get some new solution, mix up a new batch. So that is washing the buckets. After they're all washed, I give them a good rinse. So here I am taking them all into the sink, give them a little rinse, dump the water and solution out, and then it's time to fill the buckets. Now, when you are filling your buckets for cut flowers, you should be using a flower food solution. This is the one that I use. Again, it is also by Syndicate. It kind of goes in the same series as my cleaner. And this is called Aqua Plus. So what the flower solution is all about, there are a few different components in there. So there's typically a bacteria, like an antibacterial, a citric acid, and some type of like a sugar element. So this will ensure that your buckets are clean and, help bacteria not to grow. And then also feed your flowers, encourage them to bring that water up so that they stay hydrated and fresher longer. So that's why, that's the components of the flower food, which those are all very important things. So I do encourage you to use some type of a flower solution. It typically is a powder. There are some that are liquids. There are also some that come pre-measured in like almost like little tea bags. Those are cool. I do like those, but I just use this, and it comes in a powder with a little scoop. So again, you should be familiar with roughly what the ratio should be. Realistically, are you going to totally measure out every single drop of water in all your buckets? Maybe not, but what I suggest is knowing what the proper ratio is and measuring even just once on your different shaped buckets. So you can say, okay, I know a gallon of water is this full, and it's 1 scoop per 2 gallons. I'm making that number up, but you know what I mean? Just measure it at least once. And even if you want to print a picture and draw a little line on the picture so that you know roughly how full it should be with how much flower food, it's a good idea so that you're not just totally guessing willy-nilly. Again, I don't expect that you would measure this every single time or be overly precise about it, just to be realistic here about like realistic use of this whole process. But it is good at least once a season, even if you want to sort of refresh and know like, okay, 1 large scoop is 1 gallon, and this bucket, the bigger one, I like to put this much in, which is 3 gallons, so 3 scoops. Just kind of get a little bit of a working knowledge, a familiarity with it, so that you're not totally off base, even though we don't have to be, overly precise. We're not necessarily making a shortcake here, but we don't want our numbers to be so wrong that it's like, what's the point in using it? It's so diluted. So again, use your own judgment, find a balance in that so that you can know the proper amounts, but also be able to, not have that hang you up to where you're like measuring it so perfectly and it's just hindering you. Hopefully that made sense. Anyway, so when it comes time to fill the buckets, I like to line up all my clean buckets and go through with my little bucket of flour solution and my scoop. And I have a chart, like I kind of said before, I did make myself a chart. So I know the smallest bucket that I use gets about a 1/2 scoop. The larger ones get about 2. And then my like average size buckets get 1 scoop. So I go through and I, scoop out my powder and drop it into each bucket. But what I like to do is I like to leave 2 buckets without flower food in them. Now, if I'm really being particular, I prefer 2 buckets with no flower food to be 2 of my standard buckets with a handle, like this 5-gallon bucket here. So what I do is I'll take my 5-gallon bucket. This is cleaned. I'm going to use it for flowers, but right now it doesn't have food in it. I leave all my other clean buckets out on the floor in lines, just kind of, lined up. And then I will take this bucket, put it in the sink, turn the tap on, and I'll go find something else to do. I'll go grab the flower box from wholesale and start taking the ropes off and, cutting off the tape and opening the boxes. Meanwhile, this is sitting in the sink, filling right on up, which is perfect. I know I talked about how I hate taking buckets in and out of the sink. I also hate waiting for water to fill a bucket. So by not having flower food in this, I can fill it all the way to the top. I can kind of forget about it. I can, it can accidentally overflow, which I don't try to do, but if it does, it doesn't really matter as much. While I'm unpacking the boxes, getting things set, every so often I'll pop over to the sink. Okay, it's getting about, 2/3 full. That's heavy enough for me. I will pull this out of the sink, put my other empty 5-gallon handle bucket in the sink, and I'll take this one and just start distributing the water. So dumping it into my other clean buckets to start filling those. Honestly, it's a little bit of a finicky process. I hope you followed with that. But like I said, this keeps me from standing around waiting for a bucket to fill. It also allows me to not have to lift every single bucket into the sink. If I get this full, 2/3 of the way, I'll use that water to fill 2, maybe 3 of these smaller buckets. So with one lifting in and out of the sink, I've filled 3 buckets versus having to go in and out of the sink 3 separate times. The other thing is, if I'm doing a bucket like this, it's like an awkward amount. It's not that much water. It's enough that I would have to stand and wait for it to fill, but it's not enough that I can go grab a box and pull the strings off and start pulling out my flowers while I wait, because by the time I walk across the room, it's full and there's flower food in there and I got to get over there and I got to get it out of the sink. So I use these filling buckets. That's what I call them. I don't know if anyone else does this whole process or if everyone else just doesn't mind putting buckets in and out of sinks and waiting for water to fill, but I use the filling bucket process just to make it all a little more smooth, a little more efficient, and so that I can go do some other little like unboxing tasks while my filling bucket is getting filled in the sink. Like I said, it's kind of hard to explain, especially if you are only listening to the audio on this. But if you are a little fuzzy on that, you want me to like kind of hash through that again, just send me a message. We can talk about it. But basically, drop in your flower food, throw your extra bucket in the sink so it can just keep filling right on up. And when it's full or full enough for you to lift, bring it on out and start filling the buckets up. And while you're doing that, put the other one in so that sink just continually is filling up your buckets. You don't have to turn the sink on and off. You don't have to keep a super close eye on the levels because, there's no flower food in them, so it doesn't really matter how full it ends up. Once you start doing it that way, it feels very natural. It doesn't feel overcomplicated as much as it might sound that way right now. So moving on from there, so now you have your buckets, they're clean, they have your flower food in them, they have water in them, and it is time to start officially processing the actual flowers. Now, I'm not going to get too detailed into this. We're going to do like a brief most common scenario run through, and then if you have something really specific, you're like, hey, how do you process this, that, send me a message and we can chat more. But the standard way to do your flowers is something like this. So I'm going to take this first. This is called stock. Stock is a pretty popular wedding flower. I love them. And like I said, I'll treat the stock as almost like my most common run-of-the-mill process. So first thing I like to do is find my knife. I have sat it down somewhere and I don't know where I put it. I guess that doesn't matter too much. Normally I have a knife and a pair of clippers. The knife ran away on me, which actually this is pretty normal for me. I always set my knife down somewhere. Doesn't really matter. So take your knife if you have it, or your clippers you can use just fine, and cut the plastic off. So a lot of flowers come with a plastic sleeve on. Never pull it off over the top. You could pull it down the bottom, but I don't love that either. What I love is just to cut it right off. So using your knife or using your clippers or just ripping it, just start at the bottom and tear it away. So cutting right up, and there you go. I'm just gonna put that in there for now. The next thing I like to do is remove the rubber band. So there's a little rubber band at the bottom. Now and then there is a rubber band over the plastic. You would take that off first if there is. But so then I like to just cut the rubber band off or just like slice it off with my clippers. And then again, standard flowers, what you would do if there are any leaves on the stems that will be underwater, you'll want to remove those. These stock are pretty beautiful. They already have basically no leaves on the bottom 2/3. So I won't need to do that with them, but normally take the leaves off if they're going to be in the water. And then I just like to cut about 1 inch off. I just go through, do maybe 2 stems at a time or so, cut at an angle, like I said, about an inch or so, and then you'll drop them into your bucket with water. I'm just going to put them down here for now. When you drop them into the water, sometimes you can kind of lift and drop them back down again, just to make sure that they're aligned and that the stems are all down in the water drinking. So that, like I said, is kind of your standard. Cut off the plastic, cut off the rubber band, cut at an angle about an inch off. Now, the most, I guess, proper thing to do would be to cut them with a floral knife. A floral knife typically cuts more of a clean, sharp cut than your snippers will. But in my opinion, the most realistic day-to-day type of process is using the snippers most of the time. If it's a really soft stem, like a tulip, maybe even an alstroemeria ranunculus, a lot of times I will use my knife because it does do a better job of a clean, sharp cut versus smushing the stems. But for a lot of product, the snippers work just fine. And when you are processing hundreds of blooms, they are the realistic option, in my opinion. So that's what I use for that. Now, I'll do just a couple of special cases. So this is a bunch of limonium. Limonium is super branchy and bushy, very similar to baby's breath. When I'm processing something like this, baby's breath, maybe even cushion palms or daisy palms, which have all those laterals, those like side shoots off their stems, sometimes I will leave the plastic on bunches like this. Once they're in the bucket, when they have so many branching arms, they tend to get sort of tangled. So leaving the plastic on keeps them from getting all tangled and just makes my life a lot easier. Kind of by coincidence, I guess, those things, so cushion mums, daisy palms, baby's breath, limonium, they all tend to be really hardy and long-lasting product. So I'm also, you know, they're not as like sensitive and fragile. So leaving the plastic on doesn't really bother them. So cutting off that rubber band, giving the bunch a trim about an inch or so. If I didn't need it this long, I could trim it shorter, but I'm gonna leave it that way for now. And then into the bucket it would go. Now today, because I'm sort of demonstrating, I'm holding them up in the air longer than I normally would. Normally, as soon as I make that cut, I'm trying to kind of like, it's almost like there's a clock running. You cut those stems, all right, you have to get them into their water as quick as you can so they don't start, you know, taking up any air or having even bacteria, dust, whatever, end up on those cut stem ends. You want to get them right into the water. So don't cut your stems and then tell your coworker a 5-minute story, cut the stems, put them in the bucket. Like I said, today I am kind of holding them up in the air a little longer. Frankly, I'm probably going to give these all a fresh cut and put them into the buckets over there when we're done here. Okay, so then another special case, roses or spray roses. So typically roses and spray roses come with a sleeve like this. It's either corrugated cardboard, sometimes like a plasticky material, and there is usually that plastic cellophane as well. So when I do my roses, again, cutting off all of the rubber bands. This is where I do like to use my knife a little better or scissors, but the snippers are fine too. Pull off that clear cellophane plastic. And then for roses and spray roses again, I leave this part on. So it's almost like a rigid collar around the blooms. Not all spray roses come with this, but almost all standard roses do. I leave that on. I will cut the stems. When I do my roses, I am a little more particular. Typically, I will cut the stems one at a time. Some other flowers I might cut 2 or 3 at a time, but roses, more often I do one at a time. A nice, clean, angled cut about an inch from the bottom, and into the water they will go. Now, like I said, put them right in the water, but for today's purposes, I want to show you one last thing. So I'll put them in the water like this, cardboard on and everything. After about an hour or so, that's when I'll remove all the cardboard collars. They're typically stapled on. You do want to be gentle, but I'll just pull apart at those staples, unwind and unravel. A lot of times inside, in between the roses, there's more cardboard and paper. My dog is barking. That scared me. But like I said, I like to leave that on, wait that hour, then take the cardboard I find that way, if they were a little dehydrated and their necks weren't fully like turgid, it gives their necks time to drink up the water, straighten up, so and the cardboard holds them in place before that happens. I do want to take it off before that hour, well, before 2 hours at least, so that if they do start to open, they're not scrunched trying to open up with the collar on. So leave the cardboard, wait an hour, take the cardboard off, is the easy way to explain that. Okay, my dog I think is done barking now. I don't know if you could hear her or not, but anyway, so then one last part really quickly that we'll kind of go through here, some of the greenery. So for foliage, something like this is Italian ruscus. It's a tall, kind of almost like viney type of greenery. A lot of times, I know we said earlier, take off the leaves that are going to be underwater. A lot of times with my foliage, I will actually leave on most of the bottom leaves. Now, if there's something that was squished by the rubber band or it's clearly just like hanging on by a thread, I will pull that off. But something like this, it might end up in water, this deep, which is covering the bottom couple, rings of leaflets. And honestly, foliage is so hardy, that's not going to make it die before the wedding. If your foliage, gets wilty in 3 days, it probably wasn't great foliage to begin with, for the most part. There are some baby eucalyptus can be sometimes a little more fragile. There are some fragile foliages, but most of them, a few leaves in the bottom of the water won't bother them. And sometimes foliage like this, I will use those bottom leaves if I'm cutting shorter pieces for center pieces, or pulling off those bottom leaves and using them for boutonnieres, something like that. So I just like to leave them on, partly because I can use them, partly because it won't really bother the quality of them, and partly because both of those things, not taking them off also saves time. So all factors considered, a lot of times I'll leave that foliage on, just get rid of the rubber band again. Sometimes I'll just do the whole bunch if it's a smaller bunch of ruscus like that, and then boom, that'll go into the water. And then again, with your more like woody branchy foliage, here's some huck. So huck has more of like a woody sort of a stem, almost like a twig. So with my huck, I will get rid of that rubber band, and I tend to leave things sort of in a bunch, just because they fit into my buckets better that way. I'm not like overly fluffing it, pulling each stem apart individually, but I'll take the whole bunch and give, again, a fresh cut. Now, sometimes with these woody stems, I am going to pull it apart for the sake of showing you. Sometimes you'll cut right through, no big deal. Now and then you get to a kind of chunky stem that you can either go and get if I have these little guys hanging off, I cut them off too. But whatever. Cut off little guys that are hanging by a thread if you have them. But like I was saying, if I get to a thicker sort of a stem, I will either go get my heavier pair of snippers, or I will take my snippers. Let me get rid of this little guy. I'll take my snippers, cut partway through, and then simply twist to snap it. So I'm actually twisting it, it's snapping, and then I'll cut that little bit that was left. So I'm really more snapping that end. I like to snap it with my snippers versus just taking my hand and snapping it, because then you can cut that last like thin layer of bark membrane that's holding it together. So just to show you once more, on a thick sort of woody stem, take your snippers, squeeze partway, kind of as far as you can, then just twist your wrist, it'll snap, and then cut the rest of the way. So that's how I like to do those heavier woody stems. All right. So, like I said, this didn't cover every single scenario, like a bunch of this, a bunch of that, certain processing steps. Some flowers need piping hot water. Some have little baggies of water on the bottom that you have to remove. There are a few like wild cards in there, but I'm hoping, that covers, I would say, your main bread and butter types of materials that you'll ever use. If you have something strange that you've never used before, you can send me a message. I'll let you know if it's a special kind of a material, and you'll be on your way. But I hope that that was helpful. If you have questions or comments, or if you're like, oh my gosh, I loved that, let me know. We can chat. And I think that is pretty much it for today. So happy flower processing. If you enjoy this, feel free to, depending on your platform, give a 5-star review, subscribe, send me a message, check out the previous episodes, keep yourself, stay tuned for the next ones, and have a beautiful day. Thank you so much.